Christ is risen.
Indeed he is risen.
Hello and welcome to tonight's public lecture entitled Mortal Conflict, which is part 2 of a 3-part lecture series titled Byzantium's Untold Story, hosted by St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary. I would first like to remind everyone here present to take a moment and silence their cell phones or other personal electronic devices. For those of you that are joining us on the YouTube channel, welcome. I'd like to take a moment and remind you that you can submit questions by writing an email to ask@spots.edu. ask@spots.edu. Before we move on with the introduction, Your Eminence, can we have an opening prayer?
O Christ, the true light, who enlightenest and sanctifies every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the doing of thy commandments through the intercessions of thy most pure mother and of all thy saints. Amen.
Thank you, Your Eminence. I'm delighted to once again introduce our presenter, Mr. Mateusz Ferens, for the Byzantium's Untold Story lecture series. Having graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts in Applied Design from San Diego State University and a Master's in Art History from the University of California, Riverside, where he focused on early modern, Byzantine, and post-Byzantine art and architecture, Mateusz is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where in the Department of Art History. As his primary interest, Mateusz studies the art and visual cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. He teaches broadly on topics related to the history of art, science, and visual culture, as well as religious studies and cultural theory. He is currently writing his dissertation on the transition of the Eastern Mediterranean and specifically of Byzantine culture to early modernity. Mateusz is a much valued and beloved member of the faculty here at the seminary, bringing a decade of teaching experience. In addition to teaching at the seminary, he has taught and is teaching numerous courses at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as Edgewood College, which is a private college located in Madison, Wisconsin. At the seminary, which has been blessed to have Mateusz as one of its most dedicated fellow workers from the seminary's very founding. In addition to teaching, you have brought considerable administrative talents in helping with program organization, serving on the Curriculum Development Committee, and ongoing institutional assessments. Mateusz has a number of publications, which include Dionysius of Furna, Artistic Identity Through Visual Rhetoric, published by the Center for Traditionalist Orthodox Studies, located here in Etna, California, and is a gifted speaker, having been invited to present at numerous conferences and as we all witnessed yesterday. So again, this week's lecture series will unmask some of the controversy over the Byzantine struggle for survival. In yesterday's lecture, titled Barbaric Transmission, Mateusz explored how the representation, or rather the misrepresentation, of the Byzantine decline by influential Western historians continues to influence our understanding and conversations. If you happen to have missed it, the recorded lecture is available on the seminary's YouTube channel under the Live tab. Tonight, he will be discussing who really participated in the ransacking of Byzantine culture beyond the Latins and the Turks, and why this can change our view of Byzantine history, followed by tomorrow in the concluding lecture and presentation, where Mateusz will cover what were the key survival strategies that were adopted and what was the cost of compromise to the Byzantines as they struggled to preserve their culture. Undoubtedly, this series of lectures will enable us to learn to cherish our Orthodox past while facing the harsh realities of Byzantine history. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Mateusz Ferens for tonight's presentation, Mortal Conflict.
here for a second day of this lecture series. It is a privilege to deliver the second part of it today. I'd like to start that as part of my dissertation, I started to look into what the term and the concept post-Byzantium means. And I tried to identify beyond simply a chronological definition or something that would identify in works of art some kind of merging together of a Byzantine and a foreign element. I tried to pinpoint if there is somehow we can identify a change in character, a change in mental attitudes, or something about the ethos of the culture, and to have that be reflected in evidence in works of art and material culture and those kinds of things. Now, what I found took me back all the way down to the 13th century, and it shocked me, and it caused me to rethink a large portion of how to approach Byzantine history as a whole. And so I hope to take you a little bit on that adventure together with me as we explore today's topic. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at essentially two parts to this lecture. First, I would like to introduce to you an example. This is going to include the famous Stavrothiki of Bessarion, and we will just kind of field for ourselves the concept of the dissolution of Byzantine culture. But then I'd like to also turn to this problem that I have found in Byzantine history, the problem of self-dispossession. To what degree have the Romans, in fact, contributed to the dissolution and dispossession of their own culture? And for that, while there are examples that range all the way from, in fact, before the 13th century, all the way until the 15th century and beyond, we will focus just on the sack of Constantinople just because it is so rich with these kinds of examples. And then I'll draw some conclusions from that. Though a strange place to start, I would like to start with this cross reliquary. It comes to us from Venice, from the Scuola Grande of San Giovanni Evangelista. This is one of the greatest confraternities that happen to be located in Venice. And this particular reliquary was gifted back in around 1371 by Philippe de Mézières, who had governed parts of Cyprus and parts of the Holy Land. So you can just imagine where this, the relic of the True Cross, how it got to this scuola, to this confraternity. Now, when it comes to the exhibition of these relics that have come from the East, also icons and other objects from the Eastern Roman Empire, from the Holy Land, and the East in general, they played a very important role in the competition among different confraternities, among different monasteries, different cities in Europe. So they had a big role to play in Western Europe once they got there. And indeed, the confraternity of San Giovanni prided itself with this particular relic, as we had seen in the procession in the Piazza of San Marco, represented here by Gentile Bellini. This was one of 9 panels that they had commissioned to be painted, commemorating 9 different episodes, miracles involving that particular relic. But there was also another confraternity, a rival confraternity in Venice. This was the Scuola of Santa Maria dei Battuti della Carità. While they competed with the confraternity of San Giovanni, they did not have as famous of a relic as did the confraternity of San Giovanni. So at this point, I will pause and turn to 2 individuals that I'd like to introduce to you and combine these 2 stories together with the competition over prestige in Venice. So I'd like to introduce to you, I did not find a good picture to represent this person, but Patriarch Gregory III Mamas, who was Patriarch of Constantinople. He came from Crete, and eventually was made Patriarch of Constantinople. He was present, in fact, at the Union of Florence. He was a representative of the Patriarch of Alexandria in the Union of Florence in 1439. He was a staunch pro-unionist, and because of his, I suppose, because of his pro-unionist inclinations, he at some point, in fact, resigned from his post, put himself into self-exile around the year 1450, and made his way into Italy, where he lived since 1451. The second person that I'd like to introduce to you is this person over here. We see this is Bessarion. Bessarion has a similar story. He also was present in the Council of Florence. He, however, he came from Trebizond, which is actually a rival kind of faction of Romans. He served in Constantinople as a dignitary, eventually was made a bishop, and also put himself into self-exile because he also was a pro-unionist, and made his way to Italy, into Venice, where he took a lot of possessions of his own, transported them to Italy, including a huge library, several hundred volumes of both Greek and Latin manuscripts. This library, by the way, is the core foundation of what is known today as the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. And so that was presented to the Venetian Senate in 1468 after the fall of Constantinople. Now, the reason why I mentioned these two individuals is because they are going to gift to the Scuola of Santa Maria a cross reliquary, and this is going to play a role in the rivalry between the different confraternities in Venice. And this is known as the Stavrotheki of Bessarion. At the core is this cross. This cross was gifted by Irene Palaiologina, the granddaughter of Emperor Michael IV Palaiologos, and this was gifted to her spiritual father, who was Gregorios, the Archbishop of Thessaloniki at that time. Now, at some point, an entire kind of framing icon was built around this cross to frame it, and therefore it is called or known as the Stavrotheki. Now, at some point in its object biography, it was gifted to Gregorios III, whom I just mentioned, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople. And when Gregory III ended up moving to Italy, to Venice, he then gifted this Stavrotheki to Bessarion in 1459. This was just a number of years after the fall of Constantinople. And then 4 years later, in 1463, Bessarion was engaged in a negotiation with Cristoforo Moro, who was the Doge, or the Duke of Venice. And what they were negotiating was the sponsorship of a navy to transport yet a new crusade to battle the Ottomans and to regain Constantinople for the Christians, a similar story that we have encountered yesterday. Now, in his negotiations, he promised away this item, this cross and the cross reliquary, to the confraternity of Santa Maria, hoping to, by this way, to convince the Doge in sponsoring a fleet for the transportation of the Crusaders. When we look at the item, the cross itself is quite intricately put together, but it is difficult for us to say whether it is a Byzantine object, even though it was made around Thessaloniki. First of all, it includes ornamentation that, that mimics very closely in its stylistic form both Islamic and kind of northern styles of filigree. This is the detail at the bottom here of the cap of Monomach, an early 14th century Moscow ruler, and is now currently located, or this object is now at the Kremlin Museum in Russia. But also on the sides of the cross, we have a different style ornamentation that imitates very closely the style from the West, which is this over here that I'm showing you at the very bottom is a detail of the monumental cross reliquary that is currently located in the St. Nicolaus church in Germany. Again, it reflects what at that time were cosmopolitan preferences of the Byzantine court. So this is around the 14th century. Remember, this is after the Latins had already spent a time in Constantinople, establishing the Latin Roman Empire, and eventually, when the Byzantines took over their capital again, they were not quite the same Byzantines that had existed there before, who had control of Constantinople before. Now they were in very close ties, both marriage ties through families with Latins, and the Latins retained a presence, an unyielding presence in Constantinople, especially economically speaking, ever since the Fourth Crusade. Also, I'd like to mention a little bit of the way that the reliquary itself, or the larger framing portion, is built together. We see over here that there's a sliding portion that comes out to reveal the cross underneath, and that represents the crucifixion of Christ in what we might call a Byzantine style. It's painted in a Byzantine style. There is a little bit of a difference between this particular stavrothiki and those that come before from what we might call the Middle Byzantine era. So I'm showing you here two different examples. And in both of these examples, what we have is the relic of the true cross embedded in the central cross, which is no longer inside these reliquaries, absent both here and here, but originally the relic of the true cross would have been embedded in these original crosses. The difference here is that the cross that was originally gifted by Irene Paleologina to her spiritual father did not include any relic whatsoever. See, at that time, of course, in the 13th century, after the Fourth Crusade, the true cross was transported out of Constantinople, or stolen, or however you would like to call it, and it was not so easily accessible anymore. Now, because of family ties, the way that this cross reliquary was passed on from one person to another, when this was built, small portions or small little compartments were built in which a part of the true cross was placed, a small part of the sliver of the true cross was placed, and a part of the tunic of Christ was placed there as well. And so, as opposed to some of these Middle Byzantine cross reliquaries, this one uncharacteristically includes the relics, but in the framing portion, which is a little bit different than before. And it starts to kind of differentiate that particular cross reliquary from what came before. Also, when this cross reliquary did not look the way, or this was not the way it looked when Gregory gifted it to Bessarion. When Bessarion, who, by the way, he was reluctant to give it up, as is evidenced by the fact that he asked the confraternity if he could keep this reliquary for as long as he lived, and then after his death, it could be passed on to the confraternity. So when it was finally, years later, when he was dying, when it was passed on to the confraternity of Santa Maria, it was embellished. It was embellished with a revetment that was placed over the Byzantine item. In fact, I'll show you a few pictures here. All kinds of precious items were added to this reliquary, including ornamentation over the halos of certain figures, and this ornamentation of the halo of Christ, which also at the same time damaged parts of this reliquary. In fact, if we were to look at the X-ray, we see that nails have been driven, an entire framing portion, all of which has been added. So all these metal parts had been added or driven into this reliquary. And so it looks almost like a crucified reliquary of the cross inside, right? And so again, if you recall back to the concept of barbaric transmission that we covered last time, this is a kind of good reminder of how these objects get passed on from one owner to another. Now, as if this were not enough, the cross reliquary, the Stavrothiki, was also placed into a closet or kind of a storage container, therefore itself treated as a relic. So it contains a relic, but now itself is treated as a relic. I'll remind you that this is after the fall of Constantinople, so that something from that world that is now deemed gone or have been wiped off the face of the earth, it is now considered a relic in and of itself. And so it's been placed into this storage unit, and the doors of which were painted by Gentile Bellini. And this is around the year 1472, or right after when this reliquary was passed on to the confraternity of Santa Maria. And so at that point, the confraternity of Santa Maria ends up having a relic of the true cross to rival the dominant confraternity in Venice. And thereafter, it plays an important role in the kind of internal city politics in Venice between the different scuola. Now, I'd like to also bring to you, to your attention, the difference in styles when Gentile Bellini ends up making his, painting the door of the storage container. He ends up replicating in painted form the cross reliquary itself. But importantly, he does not follow the Byzantinizing style. He ends up transforming things into more or less a contemporaneous cartoonish type of a drawing, something that would fit the miniature style at the moment, to imitate all these iconographic forms, but he does not replicate the Byzantinizing style. So through several of these examples, what we start to see is that, first of all, it is perhaps not enough for the Italian mind, for the Italian aesthetic preference, to see a reliquary that was bereft of kind of ornamentation. It had to be embellished further. And it had to be converted or translated into contemporaneous vernacular, visual vernacular, in order to kind of fit within the society at that or the visual culture at that time. And well, what that suggests is that, well, let me also bring to your attention that the way that items at that time were valued, as we know from the evaluations of the items held by the Medici, as just an example, that Byzantine icons were deemed valuable, but only, or their value was increased depending on the framing mechanism that was used. So the more costly the frame, the much higher the price. The icons themselves did not cost all that much, or were not valued all that much. In fact, the material seems to have really determined how high the price went. So, for example, Byzantine icons that were painted were valued not as highly as micro-mosaic icons that we also find in the Medici collections. And so, again, it's almost like what we're seeing here is the insufficiency of the Byzantine object to speak for itself. There was a comment, Mateusz J, that you had made about the items speaking for themselves. That was not enough. It needed to be given a different type of a voice through embellishment and ornamentation. And so ultimately, there are several questions that we can ask from this episode and from this item. First of all, what do we mean when we mean when we say the term Byzantine object? What makes an object Byzantine? From what we had seen, the cross reliquary itself was imitating older stavrothiki from the past, from the Middle Byzantine period, but it really had to compensate for the fact that the central cross did not bear the relic itself. They had to kind of creatively do something different and something new at that time. When it was made, by the way, this was a time when the court was so impoverished that when one of the, for the wedding, I believe it was for Emperor John at that time, there was no silver or gold goblet available. They only drank out of pewter and clay goblets during the wedding ceremony. And so we can see that the original object reflected something of that from that impoverished empire that needed to be compensated in the West. In the end, when it comes to this question of what makes an object Byzantine, it wasn't the ornamentation of the cross itself, which stylistically was not, we identified it with other cultures. It was not also with its impoverished state and its imitation of previous stavrothiki. In the Italian mind is when it became Byzantine. That is to say, once it stepped outside of its culture, or outside of its cosmopolitan culture, outside of its center, you might say, out there in the world, in the foreign lands, this is an object that started to really represent for them a long-lost empire, something that was no longer extant in the world. On the map, you couldn't find it, so to speak, right? And this is how a lot of this idea of what Byzantium is comes down to us. That is to say, it comes to us through someone who has determined that this object is Byzantine. The style came to represent Byzantine art. Whereas, in fact, if we look at the cultural items that come from that part of the world, all kinds of mixtures of styles are part of Byzantine art, strictly speaking, and all kinds of changes went along over the years. But in the mind of in the Western mind, we start to see a crystallized understanding of what is Byzantine and what is not Byzantine. We can also ask a question about continuity. When they start to place creatively compensate for the lack of the relic for the cross in the center, to what degree are we talking about a continuity of empire, and to what degree are we talking about a culture that is compensating and trying to imitate the court life of the past, and at what point is it in fact something different? And finally, the question that I'd really like us to move forward with into the next second portion of today is what role did the Byzantines themselves, Greek-speaking refugees in the West, or otherwise the Romans themselves, play in the dissemination of their culture? After all, by moving his library to the West, by gifting this item to a Venetian confraternity, at some point what we're talking about is the taking of cultural items from the East and spreading it into the West. And this is what I'd like to call self-dispossession. So this is what the Stavrothiki asks of its viewer when looked at under the microscope. So this understanding of self-dispossession, how far can we trace it? And I'd like to trace the pivotal moment to the era just before the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Now, a little bit of this history it'll become necessary for me to go over the history a little bit to situate the context, the historical context of this. But essentially, what we have is a pretty brutal reign of Andronicus the Komnenos, who ends up, during his reign, there's going to be an expulsion and a massacre of Latins that happened in 1182, just as he came to power. And this this was on the back of already ill treatment of Venetian merchants in the capital. And so it sets a lot of bad blood between especially the Venetians and the Romans in Constantinople. The massacre did not discriminate between women or children. The Latin patients who were lying in hospitals at that time were also massacred. Their houses, churches, and public buildings were all looted and desecrated. And so also were the Latin clergymen. So from this point, the reason why I mention it is because this event will kind of become an important motivating factor for one Enrico Dandolo, who was going to become Duke of Venice at a time when the Latins put together a crusade and marched their way over, or sailed their way over to the east in order for what was now known as the Fourth Crusade. Now, Andronicus I was deeply paranoid, and he started to kill off a lot of the aristocracy at that time. Whoever potentially rivaled him as an emperor was either jailed or killed. And so at one point, his chief of police went to arrest a young man at that time by that name of Isakios Angelos. Now, Isakios ended up, he knew what was going to happen, so he went to his stables, got on a horse, and decided to ride past the police, slashing away at the chief of police, Stephanos, and killing him as he made his way to the Hagia Sophia, shouting that he had killed the chief of police and that he is claiming innocence. He does not want to be captured. What had happened after that is that the population of Constantinople proclaimed him emperor. And by the time that Andronicus I, who was at that time away from Constantinople, returned, what he saw was the crowd proclaiming univocally Isakios as the emperor. The reason why this is important is because it broke something within the imperial system of Byzantium. A crowd that would appoint an emperor illegitimately, because he was not born in the purple, he was not illegitimately installed on the throne. And Andronicus at that time, by the way, was brutally treated by the public. That's another break with the imperial kind of ethos. You do not let really, no matter how big the rivalry between emperors, to let the crowd beat and hack away at an emperor. His hand was cut off by some people, his teeth and hair were pulled out. People really hated him. But to let the crowd have at it for an emperor really was something that I think at this moment broke the spirit, the imperial spirit in the Byzantine mind, especially the mind of the public and the relationship between the emperor and the public. Indeed, what had happened right after this, is that a lot of usurpers started to come up. So whereas we did have usurpers, people who claimed to be someone else earlier in Byzantine history, we're seeing statistics like 6 individuals across the different lands in 1 year, right? And they just kept coming. And ever since, Isaac Angelos had to deal with them. But also, Isaac Angelos, who was never really prepared for the role as emperor, engaged in cultural dispossession of his own, of churches and other elements of Byzantine culture. And so I'm going to read to you a few passages from Nikitas Choniates, who enumerates some of these things that were done by Isaac II. He said that Isaac razed ancient churches in order to build his own tower residence, which Choniates describes as making, quote, a desolation of most of the outstanding dwellings of the Queen of Cities. He leveled several public buildings, which were magnificent buildings, quote, with no regard for the building's beauty or fear of the trophy-bearing martyr St. George, to whom some of those buildings were dedicated. He restored the church of the Archangel Michael that was previously destroyed by Turks who were marauding in the lands, but he did so by bringing marble slabs from the palace buildings, and he stole painted paintings, and meaning painted icons and mosaic icons of the saint, the works of ancient and marvelous hands from other cities and provinces where they had been considered very important talismans. He used some sort of deceit to bring to Constantinople the holy image of Christ being led away to his crucifixion from Monemvasia, which Choniates calls an admirable work of art and beauty. He removed the bronze Halki gate from the palace and transported them to his own residence. He stripped bare the renowned church called Nea in the Great Palace, which was originally built by Basil I, of its furniture and holy vessels. And so Choniates writes about this in a kind of awareness of the hypocrisy of the acts of Isaac. He writes that Isaac II thought that removal was the same thing as augmentation, and transposition the same thing as addition, and he preferred the shadow-filled depictions of the good deed, which paints the form of piety, but sketchily or not at all. Of a truth, he believed that the divinity would not be angry, but pleased should this temple be despoiled of its former splendor and left to become a nesting place for birds and the habitation of hedgehogs. He's using here phrases from biblical verses from Isaiah, while another consecrated with relics removed from their rightful place and magnificently embellished with ornaments taken from elsewhere. So Choniates basically accuses Isaac of robbing churches of holy vessels and using them for his own services. And the emperor was, to put it mildly, says Choniates, brazen enough to defile the sacred vessels which he snatched from the holy churches and used at his meals. This included goblet-like votive offerings to God, decorated with precious gems, and made of refined gold that hung in the tombs of the emperors, and pitchers used originally by clergy for washing of the hands prior to receiving the holy mysteries. And Isaac also removed the precious adornments from the holy crosses and the gospels and turned them into necklaces and pinned them actually onto his own robes. Now, when he was chastised by this by some people, Isaac became indignant and very irritated and rebuked his accusers, claiming that all things are permissible to the reigning emperors, and that between God and the ruler there is nothing disparate or contrary that would set them at a disagreement, basically saying the emperor can do whatever he wants. And Isaac then cited the example of Constantine the Great, who, as legend goes, fastened one of the nails with which Christ was crucified to his horse's bridle and also put one on his helmet, and said, well, see, other emperors had done this before. Why not? Why should I not be able to do so as well? He interestingly visited one person considered to be a prophet by many. This was Vasilakios of Rodostos, and he was very interested to know his fate or to have a conversation with this so-called prophet. But as Choniates describes, Vasilakios did not return the emperor's greeting, and instead he insulted the emperor and those who came with him. So this is a quote from Choniates, who says, bounding about hither and thither, like some frisky colt and making frenzied gestures, he insulted those present, not even sparing the emperor himself. When at last he put an end to his fitful motions, he extended his hand in which he carried his staff and damaged the emperor's painted image that was set up on the wall of his private chapel, mutilating the eyes. Then he rushed forward and snatched the emperor's cap, and the emperor at this point, who regarded the man as quite mad, removed himself thence, essentially said, I don't want any more of this, and made his way out. But I think that this moment also is so good at implicating the public sentiments and the way that other people desecrate the image of the emperor. We're starting to see is the misrule of the emperors start to also spread across the population a kind of an ill will, or it poisons the mind of the public towards their relationship with their emperor. At that time, as I mentioned, all kinds of mutinies and also protests, pretenders to the throne had risen up around Isaac Angelos. There was a Bulgarian revolt that he had to put away, and also an event that was going to become very meaningful very soon after, which was the Third Crusade and the passing through Byzantine territory of the forces of Frederick Barbarossa that I'm showing you here. Frederick Barbarossa wrote ahead of time to the Byzantine emperor, making sure that provisions are going to be set up for his troops as they pass through the Byzantine lands towards the Holy Land. However, Isaac knew that an army with Frederick Barbarossa that was coming through Byzantine territory very close to Constantinople posed a threat. At any moment they could turn on the Byzantine capital. And so as they were passing through the modern-day Balkans, he ensured that he paid off locals to harass the troops of Barbarossa to make their passage as difficult as possible. So they were attacked, villages would be burnt down. So as the army went through and was hoping to find some food and a resting place, all things were burnt down in their path ahead of time. Now, Barbarossa knew that this was done as an act of sabotage. At some point he realized that. Nevertheless, cordial relationships needed to be maintained, but this was not forgotten by his son Henry, who we'll get to in just a second. What had happened in the meantime, however, is that Isaac's brother, Alexios III Angelos, took advantage of Isaac's absence from the army and had the army install him as emperor. So another act of illegitimate succession, one right after the other, again breaking further not just the people's trust in the imperial lineage, as we will see, that's going to have major effects. But also he believed that he was going to rule better, and he was backed by the aristocracy at this point, to whom he needed to make a lot of concessions when he did become emperor, further bankrupting the imperial state. So the coup against his brother resulted in the blinding of Isaac II and his imprisonment. And then Alexios was set up as the ruler. Now, interestingly, Honiates describes this as a moment that really, again, broke something in the psyche of the public. He says, Isakios Angelos lost his throne and was devastated of power with ease, or divested of power with ease. He was deprived of his sight by those whom he had imagined led him by the hand, as though they were his own eyes. For what could be closer and more trustworthy than a brother? If water drowns us, he says, then what shall men drink? And if our limbs are armed against each other, how can they possibly work together so that we may live? And then he describes how at that time in Constantinople, all kinds of trust was broken. People were really questioning whose side are you on and trying to keep to themselves. Family members were also distrusting of each other. And also, it's telling, now we don't know if this necessarily is true, though I suspect that some part of it is true, but again, this idea that the universe is trying to resist this abuse of power. We see this in example of, after his coronation, the horse which he was supposed to ride on triumphantly, which was an Arabian horse, specifically kept for this type of an occasion, the horse refused to have Alexios sit on it. In fact, they attempted multiple times, and at one point the horse bucked Alexios off, and the crown was damaged itself, so that when they got another horse to replace him, the emperor rode through the city with a broken crown. And this was thought of as a very telling portent of things to come by not just Choniates, but those people who witnessed the whole thing and made a lot of, thought about it deeply and saw in it essentially a symbol of the illegitimacy of his rule. Now, I had mentioned Frederick Barbarossa and his mistreatment by the Byzantines as his armies passed through Byzantine territory. And this returned to really bite Alexios in the behind, because Henry, the son of Frederick Barbarossa, while he was preparing troops yet for another crusade, ended up sending envoys to Alexios in February of 1196 and demanded that the Romans pay a tribute due to the damages of the past done to his father Frederick. And this was a very large sum of money. Alexios managed to negotiate the price down quite substantially, but still had to come up with the money. Now, again, I'll pause here to bring an interesting anecdote here from these negotiations. There are Germans who visited the imperial court of the Byzantines, and the Byzantine court, of course, arrayed itself in as much of the decorative elements, costly clothing, whatever they could to impress the Germans. The Germans, however, answered them saying, "We Germans have neither need of such spectacles, nor do we wish to become worshippers of ornaments and garments secured by brooches suited only for women who paint their faces and have headdresses and glittering earrings that are especially pleasing to men. The time has now come to take off effeminate garments and brooches and to put on iron instead of gold." So you can see the different kind of, you can also see the beginnings of a Western perception of Byzantium as decadent and unmanly already at this time. It's something, again, we covered yesterday. But ultimately, what the emperor needed to do was raise money. And first, he wanted to tax his population, and the population absolutely refused to be taxed. They had already been overtaxed previously and received to give up money, especially since that money was going to Germans. Why should we, who say that we rule the world, right, be paying tribute to Germans? So then he decided that he's going to steal vessels and treasures from churches, at which point the church protested. And ultimately, he instead turned to rob the graves of past emperors. And again, this is Alexios describing this, the Choniates describing, saying, "Alexios resolved to rob the deaf and dumb tombs of the emperor, since they had no one to take up their cause. The tombs were opened, and they were stripped of every precious ornament. The only things left of those Roman emperors of old who boasted of glorious deeds were only their coats of stone. Even the sepulchre of Constantine the Great would not have been spared, and the thieves would have stolen the splendid cover interwoven with gold, which lay over it, had they not been stopped by imperial decree." That is to say, they collected just enough silver and a little bit of gold from these tombs to make up the amount, and at that point the call to, okay, we have enough, just before the tomb of the Emperor Constantine was opened and also similarly desecrated. And again, the reason why I'm bringing this up is really calls into question, at what point do we ascribe, the dissolution, you might say, of Roman or of Byzantine culture by foreigners, and at what point are we really talking about they turning the violent hand towards their own culture as well? And so in the end, ironically, this amount of wealth did not was useless because Henry had died, and so Alexios ended up using for something else altogether. But if you perhaps think that, well, maybe this is just bad emperors, and that this type of attitude did not saturate the rest of society, well, we also have such example as the empress herself, and Choniates here describes some of the things that she did, and she turned against bronze sculptures, really kind of antique works of art that were present in Constantinople at that time. Choniates writes that in her predictions of things to come, oh, by the way, so she engaged in certain divinations and the prophesying the future. And so he writes that in her predictions of things to come, she devoted herself to unspeakable rituals and divinations and practices of many abominable rites. She went so far as to cut off the snout of the bronze Caledonian boar, which stands in the Hippodrome, which is an antique statue that had been transported to Constantinople. And she conceived of having the back of the gloriously triumphant Heracles, we're talking about a statue of Hercules, which was tied to Lysimachos, Lysimachos' most beautiful work, in which the hero holds his head in his hands and bewails his fate while a lion's skin is spread over a basket. So this statue she had lacerated by repeated flogging. And ultimately, in addition to these shameful deeds, she removed the limbs of other statues and beheaded some with hammer blows as well. So the kind of, the kind of desecration of the Roman culture that we saw start already with the reign of Isaac II Angelos is continuing on, and now not just by the emperor, but other dignitaries and officials like the empress at this point. I had mentioned that this idea of now anybody can become emperor because of the illegitimate succession into imperial power by Isaac and Alexios resulted in this example, for example, of John the Fat, who ascended the throne, basically proclaiming himself emperor and starting a little bit of a riot in Constantinople, at which point a good portion of the population of Constantinople destroyed a mosque and looted large parts of the city as well. So they are now starting to imitate that which is set as examples to them by the emperor and those around him. And then we come to the history of the Fourth Crusade itself. Now, the Fourth Crusade involves right from the beginning a Roman or Byzantine involvement, because the son of Isaac II, who was also named Alexios, ended up escaping to the west, and then at some point making the claim that he was the legitimate ruler and convincing the gathering forces of the Crusades that they should move instead towards Constantinople and install him as emperor so that he can reclaim what he claimed his rightful throne. Just prior to that, the Crusaders, first they needed to establish a fleet for themselves, which they had to go into debt because they asked Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, to build a fleet that needed to be built from scratch of some 200 ships, which was an extraordinary cost. And at first, Enrico Dandolo was very reluctant to do that, but he nevertheless built the fleet for them, and they had a lot of trouble paying for that fleet thereafter. Not as many soldiers showed up as they had hoped, and instead of going on to the Middle East, the first thing that they did was sacked the city of Zara. Zara had been part of Venetian holdings prior to this, and it was a Christian city, at which point the Pope, Innocent III, excommunicated all those who took part in the siege of Zara. The leaders of the crusade did not tell their soldiers that they had been excommunicated, and so it starts to build a lot of lies that the soldiers never were told by their leaders all the way until they showed up in Constantinople. And these soldiers were convinced by their leaders that what they're going to do is to establish the rightful ruler Alexius on the throne. So they paraded Alexios in front of the city of Constantinople, confident that the people's love for Isaac II, and now his son being brought in front of their city, that they're going to rise up, overthrow Alexios, Isaac's brother, and then the Crusaders can go on their merry way, having been paid as Alexios, the son of Isaac, had promised them that they would. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. So they arrived in front of the gates of Constantinople in 1203 and ended up needing to settle for the winter. And so they settled in the lands across or around Constantinople, and the Byzantines were also quite hostile to them and started to engage in kind of small battles around the city with the Latins, and the Latins themselves engaged in plundering the countryside as well. So at some point they also attacked part of the city and ended up burning a portion of the city. And at this point, Alexius Angelos flees the city, believing that it's better for him to gather an army elsewhere and then to return. But because he left the city, the aristocracy now, not just the people, reinstalled the blinded Isaac II to the throne, and he was reconciled with his son. And at this point, the Crusaders thought, well, we have achieved what we came here for. There were a lot of celebrations. Latins were invited to the court to negotiate how much they were going to be paid so that they can move on with the crusade. So there's a problem of who's supposed to be ruling at this point, and there's a kind of a rivalry between father and son. Alexius Angelos, the son of Isaac, makes a lot of promises to the Latins. He, in fact, promises more than he had initially in order to keep them at bay. They demanded the money right now, which he did not have. He said, I'll pay you even more, but if you give me time. So he just heaped on more trouble on himself. Now, then Alexius gets crowned as emperor and starts to pay out the Latins, and so ends up procuring money from melting down church wares. The people at this point can't be taxed. They have little left over. So he turns on the property of the church, and at first people did not notice. Eventually they did, and started to really have really voice their disappointment with the emperors. Honiates writes that because money was lacking, he, meaning Alexius, the son of Isaac, raided the sacred temples. It was a sight to behold, the holy icons of Christ consigned to the flames after being hacked to pieces with axes and cast down, their adornments carelessly and unsparingly removed by force, and the revered and all-hallowed vessels seized from the churches with utter indifference and melted down and given over to the enemy troops as common silver and gold. The emperor himself was in no way incensed by this raging madness against the saints, and no one protested out of reverence for the emperor. In our silence, not to say our callousness, we differed in no way from those madmen, and because we were irresponsible, we both suffered and beheld the most calamitous of evils. And he's looking ahead towards the actual sack of Constantinople. And so at this point, fearing the wrath of the people themselves, Alexius now promises the Latins even more money, and this time to stay around Constantinople for the winter, because he was afraid that if the Latins west, surely he will be ousted from power. So he actually promised them more and had them stay in the area or winter in the area of Constantinople, which of course spells a lot of doom to come. Romans begin to take out their frustration on the Latins in the city. Previously, the Latins that were in the city, for example, the Pisans, who were quite rivals with Venetians, ended up fighting on the Byzantine side. But this time, anti-West settlements had taken over the people, and they started to take their anger out on anybody who looks Latin or Western inside the city themselves, even if those were allies. So they made no distinction between friend or foe. Anybody who looked foreign, the Romans started to attack them, burn down their buildings in the city. In the meantime, what the Crusaders did is they're marauding the countryside, and they saw a portion of the city that in fact had a Muslim mosque. And so again, they were promised to go to the Holy Land, fight the Muslims, and they just decided we're going to sack this part of the city. So they burned down the mosque and the Muslim quarters, and the Byzantines then leapt into help and to defend the Muslims in the city of Constantinople, at which point, again, they started to fight against each other. Again, a large portion of the city burnt down. This time, the winds, they're kind of fighting in the north part. They set fire to the city. The winds picked up and drove the fire southward, burning some 450 acres of the city, destroying, absolutely gutting the very core of the city from the inside. In order to appease the Latins, more confiscation of wealth from people and the church followed by Alexios. Crusaders continued to assault the countryside, and especially the monasteries and the churches in the countryside, at this point not caring about the fact that these were also Christian sites. The Byzantines continued to retaliate. The leaders meet together to try to ameliorate the situation and to keep things under control. At this point, also the Byzantines turned their attention to their own monuments. So, for example, there was a large, colossal statue of Athena that was destroyed by the Romans, and they destroyed it because they believed that it pointed to the West in a kind of welcoming gesture. So at this point, anti-Western sentiments were so high, they absolutely obliterated this ancient monument that stood there for almost 1,000 years, actually. And so they were in fact mistaken. It was pointed to the south, not the west. But so Choniates has a lot to say about their impudence. Also about destroying the symbol of manliness, right? Athena, after all, by this rabble that showed anything but good judgment. The emperor at this point has nowhere else to turn to for money, so he starts to remove heavy marbles from the Hagia Sophia itself. He removed a large portion of the silver lamps. Those were melted down to keep paying off the Latins. On the outside, the Latins burned down more churches, now seemingly, in fact, out of resentment. Having robbed them of their treasures, now it's just time to burn them down. So, Alexios Doukas. I know that I'm showing, so he is here depicted in this image. He's also showing up on this list, so this is a little bit of a preview of what happens next. But Alexios Doukas shows up and he volunteers to fight the Latins. He gains support of the people, and ultimately he tells the emperor, I will fight on your side, I will take over the leadership of our forces. Well, that's great, except that in one of the, Alexios ends up sending Doukas to basically negotiate again with the Latins. And at this point, what Doukas does is completely betray Alexios. He returned to the capital at some point in the middle of the, early morning. It was not just quite the middle of the night. But he wakes up the emperor, says, the crowds are outside, they want your head. Here, I will help you get out of the city. Complete in panic, probably half awake at this point, Alexios Angelos follows him right into the hands of the Varangian guard that Doukas had paid off, and at this point they imprison Alexios, and Alexios Doukas takes over power. So there's another coup within the city itself, and at this point, once Doukas takes over charge, he starts to openly wage war against the Latins. He demands that the Latins leave, no payment whatsoever, just get out of here. And the Latins, in turn, they decide to attack the city. And so they're preparing their forces to attack the city. And Doukas starts to make raids and try to prevent them from assembling their forces. In one of these raids, in fact, Doukas ended up dropping an icon in the middle of the battlefield and returns to the city and claimed that he had by that time returned the icon to its original monastery, but then the icon shows up being paraded by the Latins. This was the icon of victory. And interestingly, from the Latin side, since we also have Robert of Clary describes the same exact event, we get a little bit more piece of this puzzle from their side. The way that it looked like from the Latin side is they were going out for provisions. They were attacked by the Byzantines. They drove the Byzantines back. And Doukas, in fact, dropped his imperial regalia and the icon to slow down the attack as he made his escape. So, you know, the plot thickens even more. This icon happened to be the icon of the Mother of God of victory, nonetheless, right? So he loses this icon, the negotiations fail, and at this point, Alexios Doukas essentially commands Alexios Angelos to be strangled in the prison cell, at which point there's nothing else, you know, because the Latins did not accept the rule of Doukas. So they said, no, return the guy that we had installed back in his place. So then Doukas ends up strangling Alexios Angelos, and at this point the Latins decide this is the time we're just going to besiege the city, which did not prove to be easy. The Latins had about 500 knights and about 3,000 foot soldiers, or varying quality. The Byzantines could have more or less easily defended their city had they been properly organized. But at this point, there was no leadership whatsoever. Nobody trusted the leadership, and this was mostly a psychological break, which the Latins were able to take advantage of and besiege the city. The Latins end up using their naval forces, the 200 ships from Venice, to besiege the walls from the north side of the city, from the bay. They ended up creating these bridges and putting them on the masts of their ships. The masts of the ships actually overlooked the walls of the city, so the Byzantines had to build extra towers on top of their walls to rain down kind of missiles on the attackers. But nevertheless, what the Venetians ended up doing is lashing ships together, so that when they put the two bridges in between, or they put two bridges across a tower, one of the towers that the Byzantines had built. Once they took over one tower, that's all it really took for the Byzantines to start fleeing the battlefield. And they took over one tower, then another tower, and in the end took up the northern portion of the city. Now, the city is so vast that there were still people going to the market and having no clue of what's going on the other side of the city. The next morning, in fact, when the Crusaders in the occupied part of the city woke up and geared themselves for the next fight, there were no more Byzantines to fight them. Nobody came to defend the city at that point. Alexios had tried to escape, and the spirit of the city was broken, and the rest is history. Now, in conclusion, I just wanted to mention what happens afterward, because I think this is telling. When Honiates now flees from the besieged and fallen city, he describes a very interesting scene. The people were accusing him and the other escapees, refugees from the city, laughing at them, and these are people, Romans in the countryside. The Latins themselves were desecrating churches, and of course we do know, perhaps some of us know, about the looting of churches, as you can imagine, that followed immediately after this is known as the sack of Constantinople. They were using icons as footstools, things to sit on. And the people of Constantinople and the Romans in the countryside participated in this by buying off some of this looted treasure and they were, as Choniates describes, they were praising God for their good fortune, because now they were able to buy all these treasures for a relatively little amount of money. So a great kind of black market in sales of Byzantine treasures immediately came about. The largest, of course, and the most important of these treasures were transported to the west. In the end, Choniates writes, I think, something that is quite telling. He says, "O imperial city, city fortified, city of the great king, tabernacle of the Most High, praise and song of his servants, and beloved refuge for strangers, queen of the queens of cities, song of songs, and splendor of splendors, and the rarest vision of the rare wonders of the world. Who is it that has torn us away from thee, like darling children from their adoring mother? What shall become of us? Whither shall we go? What consolation shall we find in our nakedness, torn away from thy bosom as from a mother's womb?" And you know, this is kind of the question that we started off today. Who contributed to this loss? Who are the people who contributed to the ultimate dissolution of the empire at this moment? I wish that this was only a singular moment in Byzantine history. Unfortunately, in the siege of Constantinople in 1453, we see history repeat itself. Constantine XI ended up paying off his Genoese mercenaries who demanded money and payment so that they could defend the city by turning onto the church, having silver and gold from the churches melted down in order to pay his Genoese mercenaries. At the siege of Constantinople, as they were processing with an icon of the Mother of God, the icon fell down onto the ground into the mud in the middle of the rain, and they could not lift it up. Only with great amount of prayer and after a very long time were they able to lift up the icon, and then they were not able to continue with their procession. At that moment, a huge amount of hail stopped their procession as well. And so what we see is the concentrated, in this talk, what we saw is a concentrated period of a great amount of self-dispossession of the cultural items of the Byzantines. To answer the question of Choniates, we can see that it was a much more complicated answer than simply the Latins took over Constantinople. And that also, well, in conclusion, let me just say that the title of this was Mortal Conflict. In the end, the conflict was not so much about an East versus West. It is not a conflict of Latins against Byzantines. It is ultimately a conflict about the very soul of the empire that we see was poisoned quite early on in the history. What happens in the late Byzantine period is ultimately downstream of this tragedy. So tomorrow we will see, I want to invite you for tomorrow's lecture, where we will see how it was that the Romans tried to preserve their Byzantine culture and take steps to actually stop this bleeding of their culture and the destruction of their culture as well. So the different steps that they took in order to ameliorate that situation. All right, well, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for a very sobering presentation today. I would like to echo Matthew's invitation and invite everybody to join us for the final installment of this lecture series tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. It will be The Cost of Compromise. At this point in time, we will open up the floor for questions and answers. For those of you that are joining us online, please submit your questions by email to ask@spots.edu. For those of you that are here present, please raise your hand and the microphone will be handed to you. So, yes, we have a question in the audience.
Thank you so much for the excellent part 2. Very excited for part 3 tomorrow. So I have a question about the historical section about starting with Andronikos. Is it Andronikos the first? Komnenos?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Okay. So one question is, I was under the impression, and you mentioned this actually in the first part, that even the term Byzantine is used colloquially to refer to like intrigue and bureaucracy and stuff. That things like this, where there were usurpers to the throne and a lot of instability with the imperial succession, that there had been situations like that prior in the history of Byzantium. So for one, is that actually accurate? And if it is accurate, why didn't it have the same sort of major culturally and politically destabilizing effect? Or maybe did it have that effect and it was just sort of returned back to stability or something like that? I was wondering if you can comment on that. Because the externals of the situation, to me, didn't sound super unique, so to speak. So I was wondering, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent question, and something that I had thought about as well. You're right that this type of political intrigue, assassination, blinding, of course, of rivals is well known in Byzantine history, way before what I had just described. For one, I think that at any point in time, these kinds of actions do threaten to compromise the belief in an imperial, let's say, legitimacy or something of that sort. But when you have the whole infrastructure, when you have the ability to collect taxes from more than just your city, when you still have control over territories, when you still have armies to fight for you, when you still have a general belief in the sanctity of the imperial throne, and the participation of the clergy, any one of these types of compromises gets, it cannot necessarily, on its own, it cannot bring the whole house of cards down, right? But what we start to see here is too many compromises and too great, condensed of a succession of events in too precarious of a setting in terms of economy and military power. What I didn't mention, but they were waging wars every year. They needed to go out on campaign against the Bulgars. They had troubles everywhere. They could no longer tax the lands that used to belong to the Roman Empire. They were so constricted in their actions that these proved to be, in other circumstances, perhaps would not break the empire, but in this case, they conspired together to become fatal mistakes or fatal actions that ultimately were irredeemable. And also, the Fourth Crusade itself, it just snowballed. Somebody at some point suggested, well, what about Constantinople? And maybe there are so many things that could have happened that they would have just turned away from that idea. But it's just one thing after another, one justification after another led to essentially a cultural catastrophe, a civilizational catastrophe from the Romaic point of view. So that's what I'll say at the moment. There's more to say, of course, but in terms of why this moment, why did it all go so wrong when it didn't really need to, or where we have seen examples of that, of these kinds of things happening prior, I'll only say one more thing, is that prior in past Byzantine history, yes, we do see court intrigue and those kinds of things, but here we see a ripping out of something, a core, an essence of empire. It's not just, you know, the infrastructure around the essence of the empire could have collapsed and been rebuilt over time, but here we're seeing such desecration of those things that signify the ethos and the very, it's like a symbolical representation of the empire itself. Once you have that center collapse, it doesn't matter who gets placed into power, they cannot stop the falling down of this house of cards, so to speak.
I had a question about, you know, this term of cultural self or dispossession, self-dispossession, right? How does this period of time differ from the iconoclastic periods that you know, the empire lived through twice, and churches were desecrated, you know, vessels were destroyed, icons were destroyed. You know, how is this different that we don't recover in this case?
Yeah, that's, you know, a good question. I do think there's something of self-dispossession in, like, all iconoclastic endeavors have an element of self-dispossession in it. If you look at the Protestant Reformation, we have huge amounts of iconoclasm going on there too. It's a little bit closer to this period, but it is an intentional, attempted of self-dispossession of those things deemed to be contaminating one's own identity, cultural identity. And so it's a kind of like a purifying moment. And so if you're asking about the differences between what we see here to what we saw there, previously we had defenders of icons, we had attackers of icons, depending of who the emperor in power was, and therefore, you know, whose actors were able to commit some of these crimes. What we had is an attempt to self-purify our culture, but it was still an attempt to remove from one's own cultural identity those things that they believed were not part of it. In iconoclasm, the iconoclasts believed that icons should not be part of Orthodox worship. And so they had a sense of what orthodoxy is, and they wanted to stay true to that frame of orthodoxy. And of course, through the Church Council, the actual frame of orthodoxy was established as something different, right? In this case, we have people, these Romans, both emperors and people, who are not trying to have a sense of what it means to be Byzantine, and therefore trying to remove elements that they're deeming as not part of their culture, and therefore keeping their culture somehow sacred or pure. We are just seeing a complete sense of disenfranchisement and a complete sense of resentment towards one's own culture, probably because of the way that the people themselves were mistreated, the way, you know, overtaxed, and of course the example set by the emperors themselves to begin with. And so I think that's how I would explain the differences then. But of course, an element of self-dispossession is present in both.
Okay. We have a question from our online audience that says, it appears as though these fateful events are concurrent with an underlying mode of significant spiritual apostasy. Can you comment on this? And then, can you make any commentary on the 13th century sainted emperor of Nicaea, Saint John III Doukas Vatatzes?
In terms of what happens after the fall, those who established, so the Romans split off into several groups. They established a so-called empire in Trebizond. There's the despotate at Epirus, and Nicaea becomes a very interesting place, because Nicaea is going to be, of course, that lineage that ultimately ends up taking over from the Latin Empire in Constantinople in 1261 and retaking and therefore reclaiming, claiming for themselves an unbroken line of imperial lineage. The problem is that what happens with them is that immediately after the fall, in trying to establish an identity for themselves with no promise that they will eventually retake Constantinople, or they tried right from the start, is we see an interesting break from Romanness. They actually adopt a Hellenic identity at some point. The idea of a Hellenic connection as opposed to a Roman connection starts to appear in their history books, and in fact some people do trace the connection of Byzantium to modern-day Greece at that point, though that connection is tenuous depending on who you ask. But only when they are able to reconquer Constantinople do they say, okay, let's go back to the Romanness of this whole thing, and let's just scrap this episode in our identity when we played around with a few other identities to see what would work, what would work as a legitimate identity. So, and in terms of spiritual apostasy, that is seen much more clearly after the Council of Florence, or building up to the Council of Florence. And therefore, if I were to describe what happened in the siege of Constantinople in 1453, the element of spiritual apostasy is seen very clearly there, especially with the example of the icon that simply refused to be lifted up. Right? We see, the Hagia Sophia. There's a cloud that circles at some point above the Hagia Sophia and dissipates into the space, and that was understood not just by the Christians in Constantinople, but also those who were watching from across the bay, including there's some Russian travelers who saw it, and the Muslims. All of them agreed this is a sign that God is abandoning the city, right? So all these examples are very clear at that moment in history. Here, we see inklings of that. The empress, for example, engaging in certain divinations and like pagan elements start to crop into culture. At some point later, soon after, people who are losing their sense of orthodoxy and Christianity in general, starting to make fun of the liturgies by these plays that are put on in which the liturgies are mocked, and that happens, on the outskirts of the empire. Of course, these are people who are also engaging with Muslims. There are Roman troops who are fighting for Islamic leaders. There are Muslims who are fighting together with the Romans. This is what was called, admittedly from the Ottoman perspective, but the Wild West of the Ottoman frontier. It truly was wild. And at this point, to draw lineages, and we saw in the siege of Constantinople, Christians turning on, or the Roman Christians turning on the Latin Christians inside the city who had just previously helped them fend off one of the Latin attacks. We're starting to see, and then Christians defending the Islamic mosque in the city as well, just because they happened to be attacked by the Crusaders, right? So what we're seeing is kind of a splintering of loyalties, of religious loyalties, right? And that launches the empire into a spiritual crisis. I think this is the beginning of then what we see end up happening in 1453, where at this point half the city hates the other half of the city, where people are refusing to worship in the Hagia Sophia as this is a tainted site. There were, in the words of Dukas, the historian, they treated it as a temple of Apollo. It was pagan for what was worth for them. And so here we're starting to see the massive jolt that just left everyone scrambling for a religious identity or a spiritual identity.
So I guess in the history of Constantinople, there were numerous times where, through miraculous interventions, the city was saved. And today the church commemorates the feast of Saint Andrew, the Fool for Christ, who saw the vision of the Mother of God, with her protecting veil, which was again in defense of the city. So there were multiple examples in, I guess, the consciousness of the city that the city has been saved from forces. So why was it that here the rulers and the citizens were engaging in melting down church vessels to pay tribute, or to pay off potential invaders when, they had proof that the Mother of God should be their hope?
Yeah. Interestingly, Choniatius comments on this matter. The understanding is that this is a city protected by the Mother of God. If anyone were to take it, it would spell the apocalypse. There were prophecies already that when the city was going to fall, this was associated with Muslim conquests, but the idea was that this is going to spell the beginning of the end of the world. And Choniatius writes, this just happened so matter-of-factly. There was no, blood rain from the sky. The sky did not turn red. And he lists several things that, from the apocalyptic narratives that he said, this is kind of what we expected the fall of Constantinople to look like. And it looked like it just happened, just one day the enemy was outside the city, the next day they're looting, committing all kinds of crimes inside the city, and there was no signs, no miracles. He says that, right? No apocalyptic events, and clearly you can hear in his words a little bit of this trauma, and trauma meaning not being able to fully explain what happened, right? And what I would go back to is just say the protection was gone for some reason. And the reason that I would give is precisely because it's not that God abandoned them so much as they just started to abandon God. They just started to abandon their commitment to trusting God yes, it was a dire situation, but to turn to iconoclastic means to try to ameliorate the situation is no clearer statement than to say we are abandoning God or our trust in God, that God will help us and save us. And that's what I would say ultimately happened on a spiritual level.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Or is there any? Yes, Your Eminence?
Well, I'm concerned a little bit for some of our listeners who might be struggling with the lesson of this. Did the Byzantines deserve this, and were the Crusaders justified in the sack, which would not be an unreasonable interpretation of the data that you present in the lecture. And it doesn't, because you have focused really on the Byzantines themselves and not on the Latins and what they were up to and how it was a betrayal of pure Christianity from the get-go. There was political intrigue behind it, and what happened actually with the sack, the sacrilege that they committed, inhumanity of it, the not just the looting of the city, of course, but the actual bloodshed, debauchery, sacrilegious acts in Hagia Sophia and so on that are well known to history. So I hope you're going to focus on that at some point in perhaps your final lecture, what the actual sack looked like. And for sure, there's a valid point in that every calamity that Christian civilization suffers, in a certain way, they bring it on themselves. It doesn't justify, on the other hand, the acts of the marauders, those who perhaps become instruments of God's chastisement. So I hope maybe you want to say something about that now.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, because it's and I was just thinking also there's a perfect analogy or a corresponding sort of thing with the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
Okay, many of the saints said that that we brought this on ourselves in a certain way, or foretold it and said that looked out on the church, on society, and said that we have lost our salt and calamity awaits us for the sake of that. But we certainly have to stop short of justifying the Bolsheviks in that situation and saying that they were, as it were, right. So it's a careful. I hope you're going to maybe you want to say something about that now.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I'd like to go back to the writings of Choniates, because he himself thought about that too. He had written an entire history of how it got to that point, and he was able to identify all the steps that were taken, especially on the sides of the Romans, to lead to where it got. But he takes some time in his writings to try to assess the blame. And he says that, yes, the way that we behaved was bad. The way that our emperors behaved was bad. And he lists it kind of like in a succeeding order of who did the worst crime. And he stops last with the Latins, because he says that ultimately they're the ones who put the Christian cross onto their backs. They're the ones who set out to reconquer Jerusalem from the infidel, that is to say, from Muslims. They are the ones who betrayed, well, previously the emperors had betrayed their commitment to, let's say, to support the church, or other commitments that they had. Well, the citizens of Constantinople certainly did not show themselves in good light. And as he calls them all kinds of names, but ultimately it was the hypocrisy and the complete turning around of the very sign of the cross against people who are themselves Christians, as the final and the most egregious act of essentially he calls it an anti-Christian act. He lays the blame at their feet as the final moment. And I'd like to, as the kind of the most, the place where we can lay the most blame for what had happened. And I'd like to corroborate that too. If you look at the history of how they got to Constantinople in the first place, you see a succession of lies, lying to the Pope as to what their plans were. There were economic gains that motivated them, but not the soldiers themselves. The soldiers had pretty much throughout this entire episode gone to their generals and said, well, when is the time when we finally leave this place and move on towards the Holy Land? The generals kept lying to their soldiers. So deceit, and this is almost like a study in the psychology of how, once you take one step to compromise ethos, once you start lying about what it is that you're actually wanting to achieve, it just takes you on a path, onto this destructive path. And so I'd like to say that at this point, it's very difficult to find redeeming qualities on either side. But at the same time, one last thing that I'll say on this matter is that the Pope himself, Innocent III, he excommunicated the Latins for attacking Zara. He told them they are absolutely forbidden to go towards Constantinople. And he kept pushing. They stopped asking him permission to do things because they knew what his answer was going to be. But when he finally received news that they managed to conquer Constantinople and that everything had shifted, and he no longer has to find himself to justify their actions in front of an entity that also claimed large amount of power in the world, that now being gone, he all of a sudden switches completely and says, well, I guess this was God's will, and he goes along with this and blesses their endeavor. And so in all of this, we see such great amounts of duplicity that all of this just feels like an act of cosmological evil, ultimately. And the Byzantines, I don't think the Byzantines went along, as Seraphim had pointed out, They always had intrigues. They kind of did those things that Byzantines tend to do, and sure, in more concentrated and in worse circumstances at this point, but that's perhaps part of their history. It just happens to be that their history met with a motivation that did not care about their survival and really wanted to see it destroyed. There was a lot of resentment on the part of the Latins. They wanted to see, somewhere deep inside, they wanted to see Constantinople under their feet. At least the leaders did, and that's what they accomplished. And so I think Choniates is right in assessing blame in that order. Yes, we have to keep the Byzantines accountable for what they did to their own culture. Ultimately, in the end, the great compromise of their own spiritual or Christian ethos came from the side of the Latins, unquestionably.
And they were the aggressors. I mean,
well, yeah, at this point it's difficult to say who, yeah.
well,
yeah.
they were not invited.
Well, Alexios, I mean, depends who you say, because if it's Alexios, the son of Isaac, he's the one who invited them to put him back on the throne. If we are talking about him being part of Roman society, part of Roman imperial lineage, then we have to acknowledge that something of the imperial lineage compromised itself in the face of a Latin force that was rearing to take advantage of it. But if we say ultimately that no, he and these emperors that I had just listed were all pseudo-emperors, and some of the people who acted in the ways that they did were not real Romans, then perhaps we can say that indeed morality was compromised on all sides, but there were people within the aristocracy, for example, who lamented all of this. Choniates, for example, he puts himself in good light. Obviously, he's writing the history, but he sees what's going on, and it's difficult to see how people like him are to blame for what was going on. He blames himself for not doing more, but there were righteous people at that time as well. They just were too few in number to really stop what was going on. But yeah,
you made a comment where you sort of referred to Serafim's question about the Byzantines being engaged in intrigue and this and the other, and that's sort of like, yes, that was sort of the Byzantine thing to do. But I guess in my church history class, Father Forti was explaining to us that the Byzantine Empire is one of the longest lasting empires, and it was one of the most accomplished culturally in terms of not on all levels. It was one of the most accomplished civilizations, and they thought of themselves as Roman, and so like where, with the example of Saint Justinian the Great, there's all these examples of just massive achievements on not just spiritual but also culturally, politically. The code of Justinian is the basis for our legal system now. So where does the shift become to where this moral decay sort of takes over the psyche of the empire?
Well, I wonder, where do we get the expectation that emperors and representatives of the Byzantine culture are to be held to almost like a sacred standard? They were always people who, yes, we have occasional heroes and we have occasional villains. For the most part, they all fit somewhere in between that line, very often embedded in one individual who does both righteous things and despicable things throughout their lifetime, right? And so again, with this understanding of we seem to be placed in this position of either needing to treat Byzantium as something sacred, or on the other hand, just like Gibbon did, as something absolutely profane. And the history shows us that, it was laced with both sacred and profane elements throughout. And we occasionally, that actually makes the accomplishments of people like Justinian with the law, those people who were rulers who corrected a lot of the trajectory of an empire that was perhaps heading in the wrong direction, right? That makes their accomplishments stand out more so, if you understand the history in that way, than just the fact that this is the standard that we expect of all emperors, and everybody else just simply fails to meet those expectations. Perhaps the standard is something like fratricide and those kinds of things, and it's a mark of restraint, for example, that as opposed to what happened in the West, where rivals were assassinated or killed or executed, in the Roman Empire, that was understood to be barbaric. Blinding was, of course, the substitute, but blinding still allows somebody to live out their life as a monastic, perhaps somewhere else, right? It is a kind of mutilation. We think of it as barbaric from our modern perspective. It was, in fact, very gracious in the context of medieval history. And so I really wonder about, let's think about what expectations we have of a history, especially of a history that we claim to be at least partly our own as, an Orthodox Church.
I have one last question, and unless there's any other questions in the audience, just from a percentage-wise, so today's talk really focused on the Byzantines' acts of self-dispossession, right? But if you travel to Venice, or you travel to the Vatican, or you like the relics of Saint Isidoros, right, are in Venice. How did they get there, right? There's just so many relics. What percentage, if you could say, like, do we know what percentage was self-dispossession and what percentage was straight up looting and stealing? To where you can put that in context, because today we really focused on sort of like, okay, this is what the Romans or the Byzantines did to themselves, right? But are you able to say, okay, this is good for us to know, good for us to keep in mind, but on the grand scale, this accounts for 20%, 30%, do you have a sense of that?
Essentially, you're asking the question, to what degree can we say that of the dispossession of Byzantine culture as a whole, to what degree was self-dispossession a part of it, as opposed to the dissemination of Byzantine culture by external forces?
By violent means.
By specifically violent means. You'd have to look at the larger history, including also Ottoman raids, and the much longer history, including, for example, like Bessarion, who goes to the West and gifts away his possessions of these sacred objects. I mean, the problem is, where do you place somebody like Bessarion into all of this? Is he engaging in an act of self-dispossession? Do we count him as a Latin, or do we count him as an Orthodox person who betrayed the Orthodox ethos? It's very difficult to say. I would say that self-dispossession plays a smaller percentage than foreign robbing of Byzantine culture. But more accurately, it's not about quality so much as it's not so much as the quantity as the quality of it. When the Latins start to sack Constantinople, they do it systematically. You see, what the Romans had done, and here's the difference: the Romans did not systematically dispossess their own culture. They did it out of necessity. They did it when they felt free to do it, and they felt the repercussions themselves. So they were made accountable for those things, and they regretted those things, and there's a kind of like a process of forgiveness, and of course repeating actions and forgiveness and so on, right? But the thing is that there's a qualitative difference. It was never systematic. There was not a policy of we're robbing everything that we can possibly get our hands to and moving it out of that culture. That was not part of self-dispossession. Self-dispossession was done, like I said, usually, mostly out of necessity. They wouldn't have done it otherwise had they not been driven to do so. Whereas the systematic aspect of it was a big part of Western dispossession. It was a policy to rob Constantinople, right? And so that's where I would say that the key difference is not so much the percentage, but it's like what it was really about. And the Latin perspective is much more cynical, if you want to put it that way. They don't care about the survival of these items. It's all about possessing them of their own. I think that's probably the way that I prefer to answer that question.
So it's a qualitative, not a quantitative comparison.
Yeah. Well, one more thing to say about the quantitative thing, though, is it was a smaller portion, I would say, and it was, but I would say it was probably the more significant one, because when we're starting to see, a people, when they're taken over, colonized, for example, by a larger force, and they're forced to give up something of their own culture. But what they do is start to retreat and start to identify what the core of their culture is. That's partly what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, as well as they're going to have to define what it is that Orthodoxy is about when it starts to become so diluted, right? And so usually that's what happens, and that's a kind of like a redeeming quality. Yes, people rob you, but you get to determine what it really means to be you. In this case, unfortunately, the act of self-dispossession, an act of kind of like this barbaric transmission or an act of violence directed at one's own culture, actually, rather than forcing someone into a core of their identity, it actually dissolves their identity, which is why then we see an attempt to try to reconstitute, well, what does it mean to be Roman? That's why the Empire of Nicaea thought about the idea of maybe adopting a Hellenic identity, right? And so on and so forth. So I'd say that, yes, it's a smaller part, but I think of it as the more significant part of what happens in the end, in terms of what leads to the decline and fall of the Byzantine Empire.
Okay. Well, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the follow-up with the question and answers. I look forward to tomorrow's concluding lecture, The Cost of Compromise, which will start at 5 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. And I invite all of you to join me tomorrow. Thank you.
Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and after the restoring life.
To the prayers of our Holy Master, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on us and save us.
Amen.